People who ran away from home, how did you do it? My father forced all the women in our house to stand perfectly still as living statues for hours every day because he believed women were too emotional and chaotic and needed to be trained into silence and stillness. Dad started this when I was 9 after Mom laughed too loudly at something on TV and he backhanded her. He said women's voices and movements were manipulative performances designed to control men. First, it was just 10 minutes after dinner where me, Mom, and my sister had to stand frozen in the living room while he watched TV around us. If he saw us breathe too deeply or shift our weight, he'd add another 10 minutes. Mom's feet would turn purple from standing, but she never moved. She knew what happened when we moved. The time requirements grew every week. 20 minutes became an hour, which became 3 hours. We had to hold whatever position he put us in. Arms raised, on one foot, bent at weird angles that made our muscles scream. He'd arrange us like furniture around the room and invite his friends over to admire his training methods. They'd drink beer and comment on how well behaved we were while we stood there trying not to pass out. I found out what would happen if I tried to rebel by deliberately falling over during a session. Dad dragged me to the garage and made me stand there for 6 hours with my arms stretched above my head, tied to a beam. When I finally collapsed, he added another 6. This is what happens when females think they can do whatever they want, he said while tying me back up. You move when I say you can move. After that, I learned to lock my knees and zone out, to go somewhere else in my head while my body turned to stone. My sister developed a tremor in her hand from the stress, just a tiny shake she couldn't control. Dad saw it as deliberate defiance and made her stand with heavy books balanced on her outstretched arms. When the tremor made them fall, he'd stack them higher. She started sleeping standing up because lying down made the morning sessions harder. I'd find her propped in the corner of her room at night, eyes closed but still vertical, practicing being furniture even in her dreams. We all tried escaping in different ways. Mom attempted to get help during a grocery run, but Dad had already told everyone she was bipolar and making up stories. When she tried to explain about the standing, they just nodded sympathetically and called him to pick her up. I faked illness so convincingly I ended up in the hospital, but Dad told the doctors I was attention-seeking. They sent me home with pills that made it harder to balance during statue time. My sister ran away but only made it 12 hours before Dad tracked her down and brought her home. After each escape attempt, the rules got worse. Now we had to hold objects while standing. Vases full of water that would shatter if we dropped them. Lit candles that would burn us if our hands shook. He installed cameras to watch us when he wasn't home and hired his brother to supervise longer sessions. We stood through birthdays, holidays, even when my grandmother died. Dad said female grief was just manipulation and made us stand through her funeral reception while relatives ate around us. Mom's body started giving out. She'd been doing 12-hour sessions and her circulation was failing. Her legs swelled with fluid and turned black at the toes, but she kept standing because the alternative was worse. Dad saw her deterioration as progress. She's finally learning her place, he told visitors. Soon she'll be the perfect woman, completely still and silent. He increased her sessions to 16 hours, then 20, then one day he just never told her to stop. She'd been standing in the corner of the living room for 3 days straight. Her eyes didn't focus anymore and she'd soiled herself twice, but she wouldn't move, couldn't move. Dad brought people by to admire his accomplishment. 3 days without female nonsense, he bragged. She's finally achieved perfect submission. He was planning a celebration to showcase what he called the first successfully trained woman. He told me and my sister we'd be joining Mom permanently. He showed us the medical equipment he'd bought online. 4 drips for hydration so we could stand longer without dying. Catheters so we wouldn't need bathroom breaks. Feeding tubes for nutrition. You'll stand until you forget you ever wanted to move, he said. Days, weeks, whatever it takes to fix you. He'd already picked our spots in the living room, marked with tape on the floor. My sister couldn't stop crying, but I'd been preparing. While standing still all these months, I'd been watching Dad, memorizing his routines. I knew he took sleeping pills that knocked him out for exactly 6 hours. I knew where he kept the keys to Mom's chains because yes, he'd chained her feet to the floor on day 2. I knew his friends were coming for the celebration, but I also knew where he kept the gasoline for the generator and how the locks worked on all the doors. That night, while he was unconscious and Mom stood there trapped in her own body, I found out if statues could burn. Because he wanted 3 living statues, but I decided he'd settle for 1 house full of ash. The smoke alarm started screaming within seconds of the flames hitting the curtains. I ran to my sister's room and found her standing in her usual corner, eyes closed, practicing even though it was past midnight. The orange light from the hallway made her look like she was already on fire. I grabbed her wrist hard and pulled, but she wouldn't move, just kept whispering about getting in trouble for breaking position. The smoke was getting thicker, and I could hear the fire eating through the living room where Mom stood chained. I wrapped both arms around my sister's waist and dragged her backward while she made these small, scared sounds. Her feet scraped along the floor as I hauled her through the hallway, past the flames spreading across the walls. The front door handle burned my palm when I grabbed it, but I twisted it anyway, and we tumbled out onto the grass. My sister immediately tried to stand back up in her statue position, but I held her down while the house lit up behind us. Mrs. Peterson from next door came running out in her bathrobe, and I yelled that Dad was still inside and Mom couldn't move. More neighbors appeared, and someone was already talking to 911 on their phone. Mr. Whitney from 2 houses down brought us a blanket while Mrs. Peterson kept asking if we were hurt. I made sure everyone heard me say Dad took sleeping pills, and Mom was stuck in the living room. The fire trucks came screaming down our street in less than 5 minutes. Firefighters jumped off before the trucks even stopped moving, pulling on oxygen masks and grabbing axes. 2 paramedics wrapped us in silver blankets and started checking our breathing while the firefighters kicked in our front door. Black smoke poured out, and they disappeared inside with their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They brought Dad out first on a stretcher, his body completely limp from the pills. The paramedics put an oxygen mask over his face and started working on him right there on our lawn. One of them kept checking his pulse while another one prepared an IV. They loaded him into the ambulance while more firefighters went back for Mom. It took longer to get her out because of the chains. I could hear the sound of metal being cut even over the fire. 4 firefighters carried her out, and she was still standing even though they had her on the stretcher. Her body stayed locked in that position like a board. Her feet were black and swollen, and her eyes stared at nothing. The paramedics looked confused until one of them tried to bend her arm and it wouldn't move. They covered her with blankets and rushed her to the second ambulance while neighbors watched and whispered. At the hospital emergency room, a nurse named Violet Wolf checked us over in a small white room. She had gentle hands and kept asking if anything hurt while she looked at our wrists and ankles. My sister's whole body shook like she was freezing even though the room was warm. I told Violet my sister got tremors sometimes and watched her eyes narrow as she made notes on her clipboard. She found the circle bruises on our arms from holding books and the rope marks on my wrists from the garage punishment. Violet didn't say anything, but she took pictures of everything with a hospital hospital camera. Another woman showed up about an hour later and introduced herself as Rhonda Wolf. She said she was Violet's sister and worked as a social worker at the hospital. She sat down next to us and explained that she helped kids who might be going through hard times at home. While she talked, Violet kept documenting more marks on our bodies. She found bruises on our ankles from when we had to balance on one foot and old burns on my sister's palms from holding candles. Rhonda watched everything and wrote notes in a small notebook. 2 police officers came in to ask about the fire. The older one had a recorder and asked me to explain what happened. I told them I woke up to smoke and grabbed my sister to get out. My sister started to say something about the chains and Mom standing, but I squeezed her hand and she went quiet. The officers asked more questions about where the fire started and if we saw anything strange. I kept my answers short and acted confused about how it started. They said they'd need to talk to our parents when they were able. A man named Tyrone Wolf arrived next and said he was the fire investigator. I realized this whole family must work in emergency services when he mentioned being Violet and Rhonda's brother. He had soot on his uniform and said the fire started in multiple places around the house. He asked if we noticed anything unusual before the fire started. My sister was crying now and couldn't stop shaking. I'm noticing something odd about how quickly the Wolf siblings all showed up. A nurse, social worker, and fire investigator who just happened to be related. That timing feels awfully convenient, especially with how thoroughly they're documenting everything right now. Rhonda moved closer to her and said it was okay to tell the truth about anything that happened in our house. My sister looked at me and then started talking about the standing and the books and the candles. She told them about having to hold heavy things for hours until our arms went numb. She explained how Dad made us stand through holidays and funerals and how Mom had been standing for 3 whole days with chains on her feet. Rhonda's face went white as she wrote everything down. She asked my sister to show her how we had to stand, and my sister immediately went into position with her arms out. Even after everything, her body still remembered exactly how to be a statue. Another man walked into the room wearing a different uniform than the police officers from earlier. He looked at Rhonda and asked if he could talk to me alone for a minute. Rhonda started to say something, but he showed her his badge and said it was important. He led me to a smaller room down the hall while my sister stayed with Rhonda and Violet. The man closed the door and sat across from me at a metal table. He pulled out a folder and opened it to show pictures of our burned house. "I'm with the fire investigation unit," he said. "We found a gas can in what used to be your garage." He watched my face carefully as he talked. I kept my hands still in my lap and didn't say anything. He pulled out another photo showing the melted remains of the gas can. "Your fingerprints are probably all over this," he said. "Want to tell me what really happened?" I looked at the wall behind him and stayed quiet. My heart was beating fast, but I kept my face blank the way I'd learned during statue time. The door suddenly opened and Rhonda came in looking mad. "She needs a lawyer before answering any questions," Rhonda said firmly. The investigator started to argue, but Rhonda cut him off. "I've already called someone and given what her sister just told us about the abuse. There are much bigger issues here than how the fire started." She put her hand on my shoulder and guided me back to where my sister was waiting. Within 20 minutes, a woman in a business suit showed up and introduced herself as Kira Steele from Child Protective Services. She had a stack of papers and a serious look on her face. She talked to Rhonda and Violet for a few minutes, looking at their notes and the photos they'd taken of our bruises. Then she came over to us and knelt down, so she was at our eye level. "I'm declaring you both in emergency protective custody," she said. "You won't be going home even if there was a home to go to." My sister grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. Kira stood up and made some phone calls while we waited. About an hour later, she led us to a different part of the hospital, a family room with couches and a TV. A young man was already there waiting for us. He had dark hair and wore jeans with a button-up shirt instead of a suit. "I'm Phoenix Raven," he said, shaking our hands. "I'm your lawyer, and I'm here to help you." He looked younger than most lawyers I'd seen on TV, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "Don't say anything about the fire to anyone until I understand what happened," he told me. "We need to talk about everything first." Phoenix spent the next 2 hours asking us questions about our life at home. He wanted to know everything about the standing sessions, when they started, how long they lasted, what Dad made us do. My sister told him about the books and the candles and how she couldn't stop shaking even when she tried. I explained about the garage punishment and the chains on Mom's feet. Phoenix wrote everything down in a notebook and asked Rhonda to come back in to help document our injuries. He took pictures with his phone of every bruise and mark. Rhonda measured the rope burns on my wrists and wrote down the exact size and color. She found scars on my sister's palms from the candles and old bruises on both our ankles from balancing on one foot. Phoenix asked about Dad's friends who came to watch us stand. I gave him names of the ones I knew and described what they looked like. He wanted to know if they ever touched us or said anything, and I told him they mostly just drank beer and talked about how well Dad was training us. My sister started crying when she talked about standing at our grandmother's funeral while everyone else got to sit and eat. Phoenix gave her tissues and waited for her to calm down before asking more questions. He wanted to know about every time we tried to get help and what happened. I told him about Mom's grocery store attempt and my fake illness and my sister running away. He wrote down the names of the doctors and stores and anyone else who might have records. When we finished talking, it was past midnight and we were both exhausted. Kira had arranged for us to stay in a special room at the hospital for the night with a security guard outside. Phoenix said he'd be back first thing in the morning to file paperwork with the court. The next morning, a nurse woke us up to check our vital signs and bring breakfast. While we were eating, Phoenix came back looking worried. "Your dad woke up," he said. "He's telling everyone the fire was an electrical problem and that your mom has severe mental illness." He showed us a paper where Dad had written a statement claiming any strange marks on us were from Mom hurting us during her episodes. "He's trying to blame everything on her," Phoenix said. We went to see Mom in her room and she was still standing even though she was in a hospital bed. The nurses had to physically hold her down to examine her, but as soon as they let go, she'd try to stand up again. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't looking at anything. She didn't respond when we said her name or touched her hand. The doctor came in and showed Phoenix her chart. They'd found severe tissue damage in her legs and feet from standing for 3 days straight without moving. Some of her toes had turned black and might need to be removed. Her muscles had started breaking down and releasing toxins into her blood. The doctor said she was in a catatonic state and might not come out of it for weeks or months. Phoenix took pictures of Mom's legs and feet for evidence. That afternoon, Phoenix went to the courthouse to file emergency motions. He asked the judge to keep Dad away from us and Mom. He included all the medical documentation and my sister's statement about the chains and standing sessions. The judge agreed to a temporary order until a full hearing could happen. 2 days later, while we were still at the hospital, 2 men showed up asking to see Dad. I recognized them immediately from the statue parties. One was the guy who always brought whiskey, and the other one had made jokes about how still we could stand. They told the nurse they were Dad's friends and wanted to check on him. The nurse called security when they couldn't explain exactly how they knew our family or why they needed to see him. Security made them leave, and Phoenix added their names to his list of people to investigate. A week after the fire, Tyrone came back to talk to us. This time Phoenix was there and wouldn't let him ask me anything about starting the fire. Instead, Tyrone showed us photos from the fire scene. One picture showed metal rings bolted into the living room floor that had survived the fire. What were these for? Tyrone asked. My sister started shaking and I had to answer for her. I explained how Dad would chain Mom's feet to those rings during the longer standing sessions, so she couldn't fall over or sit down even if she passed out. Tyrone took more pictures of the rings and wrote down measurements while Phoenix pulled me aside into a quiet corner of the hospital waiting room. He sat down next to me and kept his voice low, asking if there was anything I needed to tell him before things went further with the investigation. I looked at his face for a long time, trying to figure out if I could trust him, and something about how he waited without pushing made me decide to tell him the truth. I whispered that I was the one who started the fire because Dad had bought IV equipment and feeding tubes to make us stand forever like Mom. Phoenix didn't look surprised or angry, just nodded and said we'd figure out how to handle it together, that protecting us was his job now. The next morning, Kira came to the hospital with paperwork and told us she'd found a placement with Chelsea Duran, a foster mom who worked with kids from bad situations. We packed the few clothes the Red Cross had given us into plastic bags and followed Kira to her car, my sister gripping my hand so tight it hurt. Chelsea's house was a normal two-story place with a big yard and flowers and window boxes, nothing like our old house with its locks and cameras. Chelsea met us at the door, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and kind eyes, and she showed us to a bedroom with 2 beds and told us we could arrange things however we wanted. That first night, my sister wouldn't get in her bed, just stood in the corner of our room with her arms at her sides like Dad had trained her. I tried pulling her to the bed, but she started crying and shaking, saying we'd get in trouble for moving without permission. I sat on the floor next to her and held her hand while she stood there for 3 hours straight, both of us crying quietly so we wouldn't bother Chelsea. Around midnight, Chelsea found us like that and didn't yell or seem surprised, just brought blankets and pillows and sat with us on the floor until the sun came up, telling us stories about other kids she'd helped who were scared at first too. Phoenix called the next day to say the prosecutor wanted to meet about Dad's charges and what to do about the fire investigation. They met at the courthouse while we stayed at Chelsea's, and Phoenix called afterward to explain they had enough evidence to charge Dad with imprisonment and abuse, but needed to figure out the arson situation. Something's bothering me about how fast Dad woke up with that perfect story ready to go, claiming electrical problems and blaming everything on Mom's supposed mental illness. That's awfully convenient timing for someone who just survived a house fire. He said he was working on something called juvenile diversion, where I'd admit to the fire in a special hearing but wouldn't go to jail because of my age and the circumstances. The prosecutor agreed to the deal after Phoenix showed him all the medical reports and photos of Mom's legs and our bruises. 2 days later, the police arrested Dad's brother at his job after investigators found text messages on his phone where he bragged to friends about supervising our training sessions. He told the cops he thought it was just discipline and didn't know it was wrong, but the messages showed him laughing about how long he could make us stand and betting his friends that Mom would pass out first. Chelsea signed us up for therapy with someone who specialized in kids from abusive homes, and that first session was hard because my sister couldn't sit in the chair normally. She kept standing up and putting her hands behind her back, and when the therapist asked her to sit down, she started shaking and said she wasn't allowed to sit during the day. The therapist was patient and let her stand while we talked, making notes about something called complex trauma that she said we both had from years of abuse. 3 weeks after the fire, Phoenix called with news that made me cry happy tears for the first time in forever. Mom had finally spoken, asking the nurses where her daughters were and if we were safe. The doctor said her brain was starting to work normally again, but she'd need months of physical therapy to learn to walk properly because her muscles and nerves were damaged from standing so long. Dad got formally charged the next week with 3 counts of imprisonment, torture, and child endangerment, plus some other charges I didn't understand. His lawyer tried to argue at the arraignment that it was just strict parenting and discipline, but the judge looked at the medical evidence and the photos of the chains and said it was the worst case of systematic abuse she'd seen in 20 years. Phoenix was there and told us later that Dad looked smaller somehow in his orange jumpsuit, like losing control over us had shrunk him. After the charges made the local news, people started coming forward with things they'd seen but never reported. One neighbor called Phoenix to say she'd seen us standing in the windows at 3 in the morning when she got up to feed her baby, but thought she was seeing things or misunderstanding. Another neighbor admitted he'd heard crying from our garage once and almost called the cops, but Dad had come out and said it was just a raccoon trapped in there. The mailman told investigators he'd noticed Mom standing in the same spot every day when he delivered packages, but thought she just liked looking out the window. Chelsea helped us get into a routine at her house, with regular meals where we could sit at the table and move around freely. My sister still shook when she ate and kept asking permission to use the bathroom or get a drink of water, but Chelsea never got frustrated, just kept reminding her she was free to move whenever she wanted. The next morning at breakfast, my sister asked Chelsea 3 times if she could sit down at the table, even though Chelsea kept saying yes each time. She picked up her fork and then put it down and stood up again until Chelsea gently pressed on her shoulder to keep her seated. We ate scrambled eggs and toast, while my sister's hands shook so bad she dropped her fork twice, and each time she jumped up like she'd done something wrong. Chelsea just picked it up and gave it back to her without making a big deal about it. 2 days later, Phoenix called with news that made Chelsea drop her coffee mug on the kitchen floor. The grand jury had come back with their decision, and Dad was getting hit with everything they could throw at him, plus some charges nobody expected. The investigators had been going through his computer and found hundreds of videos he'd been taking of our standing sessions that he'd been uploading to some website where other guys paid to watch them. Phoenix said the FBI was now involved because the website crossed state lines and had thousands of members all doing the same stuff to their families. He came over that afternoon with a stack of papers that made my stomach hurt just looking at them. Dad had taken out 3 separate insurance policies on me, Mom, and my sister that would pay out huge amounts if we became disabled from any cause, including what he called chronic fatigue or muscle disorders. The dates on the policies matched up exactly with when he ordered all that medical equipment online to make the standing permanent. Phoenix said this proved premeditation and turned it into attempted insurance fraud on top of everything else. Mom's lawyer called from the hospital the next day to tell us she'd filed the divorce papers from her bed, and the judge had already approved an emergency order giving her full custody once she got better. The lawyer said Mom could barely stand for 10 minutes now without her legs giving out completely, and she needed a walker just to get to the bathroom, but she was determined to end the marriage before Dad's criminal trial started. We went to see Mom for the first time 6 weeks after the fire at the hospital's rehab wing, where they were teaching her to walk again. She started crying the second she saw us and kept saying saying sorry over and over while reaching for us from her wheelchair. My sister ran right to her, but I hung back because seeing Mom in that chair made everything feel more real than the fire or the arrests or anything else. Mom's legs looked wrong, all skinny and pale with these dark patches where the blood hadn't been flowing right for so long. She kept trying to stand up to hug us properly, but the nurse had to remind her she wasn't cleared for that yet. The therapist at our next session brought out these big foam blocks and exercise balls and told us we were going to learn to move our bodies in new ways. She had us do these silly stretches and movements that felt weird after years of having to stay perfectly still. My sister actually laughed when we had to hop on one foot and wave our arms around, though she kept looking at the door like Dad might walk in and catch us moving. The therapist said this was normal, and our bodies needed to relearn that movement was safe and good. That same week, the news started reporting about Dad's friends getting arrested all over the state. Phoenix told us the FBI had tracked down everyone from those parties where Dad showed us off as his trained statues, and it turned out most of them were doing the same thing at home. One guy had his wife standing for 18 hours a day, and another had his 3 daughters taking shifts, so someone was always frozen in place in their living room. The investigators found chat logs where they all shared tips and competed to see who could make their families stand the longest. Phoenix sat us down to explain what would happen with my part in everything since I'd admitted to starting the fire. He said the prosecutor understood why I did it, and the judge had already signed off on a deal where I'd do community service at the library and go to counseling twice a week but no jail or detention center. He said what I did was wrong, but everyone understood I was trying to save my family the only way I knew how when all the adults had failed us. Chelsea took us to the park on a nice Saturday and told us we could do whatever we wanted. My sister stood by the car for 20 minutes before she finally walked toward the playground, and even then she kept asking if it was really okay to move around. She got on the swings, but barely pushed herself at first until this other kid asked if she wanted to race to see who could go higher. By the end, she was laughing and pumping her legs like any normal kid, though she still looked back at Chelsea every few minutes to make sure it was allowed. 3 months after everything started, we had to go to court for Dad's preliminary hearing, where the judge would decide if there was enough evidence for a real trial. Phoenix had us practice what we'd say and how to stay calm if Dad's lawyer asked mean questions. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, and Dad sat at a table in an orange jumpsuit, looking skinny and pale from jail. He wouldn't look at us when we walked in and kept his eyes on his hands the whole time. When it was my turn to testify, I told them about the standing and the books and the chains on Mom's feet. Dad's lawyer tried to say we were being coached and making things up, but the prosecutor showed the videos from Dad's computer and the lawyer shut up pretty quick. My sister testified next, and her voice was so quiet the judge had to ask her to speak up 3 times, but she told them about sleeping standing up and the tremor in her hand that made Dad punish her more. The judge looked at the videos from Dad's computer for a long time without saying anything, and then she looked at the medical reports showing Mom's dead toes and my sister's stress damage and the photos of the burn marks on our hands from the candles. She told Dad's lawyer to sit down when he tried to object again and said this was the worst case of systematic torture she'd seen in 20 years on the bench. The prosecutor showed more evidence, including text messages between Dad and his brother about the standing sessions and receipts for the medical equipment he bought to make it permanent. When the hearing ended, the judge denied bail completely and ordered Dad held until trial, while adding more charges for conspiracy and organized abuse. 2 days later, they moved Mom to a special rehab place across town where she had to learn how to walk again because her muscles had gotten so weak from standing still for days at a time. The doctors had to cut off 2 of her toes that had turned completely black from no blood flow, but Mom said losing toes was better than losing her whole life to Dad's control. Dad's brother kept text messages about making us stand. That's such a strange thing to brag about to friends. Why would someone think forcing people to stand still was something worth betting on or laughing about with other people? She started physical therapy right away, even though it hurt so bad. She threw up the first 3 times she tried to take normal steps. My sister finally started sleeping in the bed Chelsea gave us instead of standing in the corner all night, which took almost a week of Chelsea sitting with her and rubbing her back until she fell asleep lying down. Chelsea bought this heavy blanket that's supposed to help with anxiety, and my sister wrapped herself in it every night like armor against bad dreams about standing. The tremor in her hand got worse at first when she tried to relax, but Chelsea said that was normal when your body stops being in survival mode all the time. That same week, the FBI showed up at Chelsea's house to ask us about Dad's online friends because they'd found this whole website where men shared tips about training women to be statues. The agent showed us usernames and asked if we recognized any of the people, and I pointed out 3 guys who used to come to our house for Dad's parties. They'd already arrested 12 men in 5 states and found over 50 kids who were being forced to stand for hours just like us. Phoenix came by to tell us the investigation was getting bigger every day as more families came forward after seeing the news reports about our case. We started going to this support group at the community center where other kids who'd been hurt by their parents could talk about what happened without anyone judging them. The first meeting was weird because everyone just sat there not talking until this one girl started crying about how her mom used to lock her in a closet for days, and then everyone started sharing their stories. My sister didn't talk for 3 meetings, but on the 4th one she stood up and told everyone about sleeping, standing up, and how she still got scared when she had to sit still for too long. This other boy said his dad made him kneel on rice for hours, which sounded different but felt the same as our standing, and we all understood each other without having to explain why we flinched at certain sounds or movements. About a month after the hearing, Dad tried to call us through our cousin, who he got to smuggle a phone into jail somehow. The cousin left voicemails saying Dad wanted to apologize and explain his side, but Phoenix called the prosecutor right away, and they arrested the cousin for witness tampering. Dad got extra charges for violating the protective order, and they moved him to a different jail where he couldn't contact anyone except his lawyer. Phoenix helped us write victim impact statements, which was really hard because we had to explain exactly how the abuse changed our lives and what we lost because of it. I wrote about missing 3 years of normal childhood and how I still couldn't stand in one place for more than a minute without panicking. My sister wrote about the tremor and the nightmares and how she was scared she'd never be normal again, even though the therapist kept saying she would get better with time. Mom wrote hers from the rehab place about losing her toes and probably never being able to run again, and how she blamed herself for not protecting us, even though we told her it wasn't her fault. 6 weeks after Mom went to rehab, she was strong enough to visit us at Chelsea's house for Sunday dinner. She brought these sugar cookies she made in occupational therapy that were shaped weird because her hands still shook, but they tasted normal, and we ate them at the table like a regular family. Mom could only walk with a special walker and had to sit down every few minutes, but she smiled the whole visit and kept touching our faces like she couldn't believe we were real and safe. My sister showed her the school project she did about butterflies, and Mom cried happy tears when my sister demonstrated the dance dance moves she was learning in PE class. The therapist we saw twice a week said my sister's tremor was getting better because she went 2 whole days without it happening even once. She still had bad days where her hands shook so much she couldn't write, and good days where you couldn't tell anything was wrong with her at all. The therapist taught her breathing exercises and gave her a stress ball to squeeze when she felt the shaking starting, which helped more than we expected. 3 months after Dad got arrested, Phoenix sat us down to explain that the trial date was set for next month and we might have to testify again. He said the prosecutor had so much evidence, including our video testimonies from the hearing, that we might not have to see Dad in person at all. The judge would decide if our recorded statements were enough or if we had to come to court again. But either way, Phoenix would be there to protect us from Dad's lawyer asking mean questions. Chelsea drove us to the new school the next week, and I walked through those front doors feeling weird about being just another kid with a backpack and lunch money. The secretary handed me my schedule without asking about burns or scars or why I was starting mid-year, and I sat in math class working on fractions while nobody stared at me or whispered about the girl who burned her house down. My sister went to a different school across town where the kids were younger, and Chelsea said it would be better if we weren't together all day because we needed to learn how to be separate people again. The teacher asked me to solve a problem on the board, and my hand shook a little holding the marker, but not because I was scared of standing, just regular nervousness like any kid would have. Chelsea picked us up after school and took us straight to the grocery store where she taught us how to pick ripe fruit by squeezing it gently and showed us which bread stayed fresh longest. Back at her house, she let us stand at the counter while she demonstrated how to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, and my sister laughed when hers exploded everywhere, but Chelsea just handed her another one to try again. We learned to measure rice and water in the right amounts and how to tell when pasta was ready by throwing it at the wall to see if it stuck. The washing machine had all these buttons and settings, but Chelsea explained that most clothes just needed cold water and regular cycle, and showed us how to check pockets first because tissues would shred all over everything. My sister folded towels wrong the first 10 times, but Chelsea never got mad, just showed her again how to make the edges line up neat. These were things other kids probably learned when they were 5 or 6, but we'd spent those years learning how to lock our knees and breathe shallow so our chests wouldn't move too much. Phoenix called Chelsea's house one afternoon to tell us Dad's lawyer wanted to meet about a deal where Dad would plead guilty to some charges if we agreed to lesser ones that meant only 15 years in prison. We sat around Chelsea's kitchen table while Phoenix explained that 15 years sounded like a lot, but with good behavior Dad could be out in 10, and did we really want him back on the streets when we were still young adults? My sister's hand started shaking and she had to put down her glass of juice, but she looked Phoenix right in the eye and said she wanted him locked up forever. Phoenix said if we went to trial, the prosecutor was confident they could get 25 to life based on the evidence, and the federal investigation was using our case to build something bigger against the whole network of men who did this to their families. The FBI agent working the case had already connected Dad's online group to similar abuse in 12 states, and our testimony would help protect dozens of other kids whose parents were copying Dad's methods. We told Phoenix to reject the plea deal because those other families deserve to see justice happen in court, not in some backroom agreement. Mom called from the rehab place that week to say her disability application got approved, which meant she'd have money coming in every month to pay for an apartment and food once she got strong enough to live on her own again. She'd been looking at places near Chelsea's house, little 2-bedroom apartments with grab bars in the bathroom and wide doorways for her walker. The physical therapist said she could manage stairs now if she went slow and held the rail with both hands, and she'd been practicing carrying plates from the kitchen to the table without dropping them. She wanted us to know she was working hard to make a safe home for us once Dad got locked away and the court stuff was finished. My sister's school announced a talent show, and she signed up immediately to do a dance routine she'd been working on in her room at night when she thought I was asleep. I'd hear the music playing soft through the wall and the sound of her feet moving across the floor, not the careful statue stillness, but real dancing with jumps and spins and arms swinging free. Chelsea helped her pick out a costume that sparkled under the lights and did her hair in braids with ribbons that flew out when she turned. The night of the show, I sat in the auditorium watching my sister take the stage, and my chest got tight seeing her stand there in front of all those people. But then the music started and she moved like water, like wind, like everything Dad tried to train out of her came pouring back through her arms and legs. She stumbled once on a turn but kept going, and when she finished with her arms spread wide and her head thrown back, I was crying so hard I couldn't see. The trial started 2 weeks later in a courthouse downtown where Phoenix made us enter through a back door to avoid the reporters who'd heard about the case. The prosecutor laid out evidence for 5 straight days, including the videos from Dad's computer, medical records showing Mom's tissue damage and circulation problems, photos of the chains and metal rings in our living room floor. Dad's friends from the statue parties got brought in to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences, and they described the standing sessions in detail, how Dad would brag about his training methods. Mom could barely walk with that special walker but made these lumpy cookies in therapy. There's something interesting about her trying so hard to do normal mom things when everything about their family has been completely not normal for years. The defense lawyer tried to argue it was discipline that got out of hand, but the jury saw the feeding tubes and catheters Dad bought and the insurance policies he took out on us. Phoenix had prepared us for Dad to take the stand, but he never did, just sat there in his suit staring straight ahead while witness after witness explained what he'd done. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury went to deliberate and came back in 3 hours with guilty verdicts on every single count. The judge scheduled sentencing for the next month but said she was inclined to give the maximum based on the severity and duration of the abuse. At sentencing, Dad got 35 years with no possibility of early release, and his brother got 12 years for his participation. The friends who came to watch us stand got sentences ranging from 2 to 8 years, depending on their involvement and whether they had done similar things to their own families. Mom was there in her wheelchair watching when they led Dad away in handcuffs, and he finally looked at us then, but there was nothing in his eyes, just empty space like he was the statue now. We moved into Mom's new apartment the next week, a ground floor unit with 2 bedrooms and a small patio where she could sit in the sun. Chelsea helped us move our stuff and stayed for dinner that first night, teaching Mom the egg cracking technique while my sister set the table with plates that didn't match but were ours to use however we wanted. Mom could walk from her bedroom to the kitchen using her walker, and we took turns helping her with things like reaching high shelves or carrying laundry baskets. The apartment felt strange at first because we could move around whenever we wanted and sit however felt comfortable, and nobody was timing us or watching us or making us hold painful positions. The federal investigation that started with our case ended up exposing a network of over 200 men across the country who were using Dad's training methods on their families. The FBI said our testimony and evidence became the centerpiece that let them get warrants and build cases that saved hundreds of kids from the the same abuse. Our case got written up in training materials for social workers and police to recognize the signs of this specific type of control and abuse that looked like strict parenting from the outside. 6 months after the trial ended, my sister came home from the school with a permission slip for track team tryouts. She ran the 100-meter dash in front of the coach and crossed the finish line with her arms spread wide, her body moving exactly how she wanted it to move. The coach put her on the team that same day, and she practiced every afternoon, running laps around the track while I sat in the bleachers doing homework. At her first meet 3 weeks later, she won the 400-meter race by 2 full seconds. She grabbed the microphone at the awards ceremony and said she was dedicating her win to everyone learning how to move again after being forced to stay still. Mom started working mornings at a medical supply store near our apartment, using her walker to get around the stockroom and sitting on a special stool at the register. Her boss understood about her legs and let her take breaks every hour to walk around and stretch. She told me the best part wasn't the paycheck, but having somewhere to go every day that wasn't therapy or doctor appointments. I signed up to volunteer at the crisis hotline after Phoenix mentioned they needed people who understood what abuse actually looked like. The training took 6 weeks, and then I started taking calls 2 nights a week, mostly just listening to kids describe things that sounded way too familiar. Phoenix stopped by during one of my shifts and said I asked good questions that helped callers feel safe enough to talk about the hard stuff. He told me I should think about law school someday because I understood how to help people navigate systems that seemed impossible. The 1-year anniversary of the fire came on a Tuesday, and Mom spent the whole morning in the kitchen making a chocolate cake from scratch. She had to sit down twice while mixing the batter, but she finished it and even made homemade frosting. After dinner, we pushed the coffee table against the wall and turned on music, actually dancing in our living room for the first time in our lives. My sister spun around until she got dizzy, and Mom swayed back and forth in her chair while I jumped around like an idiot. Nobody told us to stop moving or stand still or hold any position. We just moved however felt good until we were all sweaty and laughing. My sister's tremors had completely disappeared by then, and she'd started teaching dance moves to younger kids at the community center after school. She made up routines to pop songs and showed them how to move with confidence instead of fear. The little kids loved her because she never got mad when they messed up the steps. Mom met a man named Robert at her chronic pain support group who had nerve damage from a car accident. He brought her flowers one week and asked if she wanted to get coffee after the meeting. She came home smiling in a way I hadn't seen since before Dad started the statue training. She took things slow with Robert, just coffee dates and walks in the park where they both used their walkers and didn't have to pretend their bodies worked perfectly. Chelsea came over for Thanksgiving and helped us cook a huge meal even though it was just the 4 of us. She said watching us rebuild our lives had been the best part of her 20-year career in foster care. She brought photo albums from all the kids she'd helped over the years and told us stories about how they were doing now. Some were in college, some had families of their own, and almost all of them still called her on holidays. We kept going to therapy every week, sitting in comfortable chairs and talking about whatever came up. Sometimes I still had dreams where I was frozen in place while the house burned around me, but I'd wake up in my own bed where I could stretch out across the whole mattress. My therapist said trauma doesn't just disappear, but we learn to carry it differently. Some nights my sister still stood up in her sleep, but now she'd wake herself up and crawl back into bed. Mom still needed her walker and probably always would, but she decorated it with sparkly stickers and called it her freedom machine. We were all different from before, but we were alive and moving, and nobody could make us stand still again. Thanks for hanging out and wondering through all of this with me. Definitely felt like a whole journey together. Until we meet again, take care. Subscribe for more content like this.